Welcome to Naylor Aglai Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. This teaching is on Daniel 11. I've titled this teaching Continual War Until the Appointed Time. Now, the opening verse of this prophecy, of this word that was given to Daniel, which is Daniel chapters 10 to 12, right? The opening verse has the phrase in it, and the word is true and the warfare great. And that really just gives an overview of this whole prophecy, Tzava Gadol, this great warfare. And we saw in Daniel 10 that there is constant warfare in the heavenly realm while life continues on this earth. There's a spiritual battle and the physical battle. Now, Daniel 11 details the great warfare from the physical and earthly side, or the earthly perspective, as we'll see in this teaching. Daniel 11 is similar to Daniel chapters 2 and 7 in that it speaks of the Gentile kingdoms and then skips to the final earthly king or kingdom, although it differs in a few areas. Number one, there's almost no symbolism in Daniel 11. The word and vision are related openly, clearly. Number two, kings and kingdoms are also spoken of directly, except for the final earthly king, which we will look at. And thirdly, the kingdom of Greece consumes the majority of the text, followed by the final earthly king, the Antichrist. So it's kind of similar more to Daniel 8, where the kingdom of Greece takes more center stage. Now, the details revealed in this prophetic word of Daniel 11 spans several centuries and then skips to the end. I just want to give a kind of an overview, an outline here. So verses 1 to 2 of Daniel 11 focus on the time period of 539 to 334 BCE, about 200 years. And then there's a time gap. There's just a jump of 150 years from verse 2 to 3. Verses 3 to 35 focus on the time period 334 to 164 BCE, a period of about 170 years. And then again, there's a time gap. And then verses 36 to 45 focus on the end times, the final 7 years, which has not yet occurred. So we don't know the exact time gap there. But this is a rough timeline of Daniel 11. As we begin to study and read this chapter, it's important to remember that it is set in a particular context, a particular setting and time. So we read in Daniel 11:1, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. So just some obvious questions, right? Who is speaking in this verse? What is the context of Daniel 11? And in what time period was this chapter written? And I just want to share briefly my own confession here, because as I have read through the Bible throughout the years, before doing an intensive study on the book of Daniel myself, as I've always come to Daniel 11, I always just thought it was its own chapter set apart from the others, not looking at it in the context of chapters 10 to 12, and thought that it's starting in the first year of Darius the Mede. But now that I've studied it in context, I've realized that the angel speaking here, is probably Gabriel, is actually going back in history as he's talking here. So again, this whole section of Daniel 10 to 12 is one prophetic word. And we know from Daniel 10:1 that it was the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. It was the year 536 BCE. So the angel, and we assume it's Gabriel, was giving context to how he and the archangel Michael fight battles in the heavenly realm regarding kings and kingdoms. So just reading 11:1 in context, we'll begin with the previous verse from chapter 10, 10:21, where we read, and the angel speaking, however, I will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth, yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. So we see here how the archangel was explaining in history what happened 3 years earlier. Now I asked the question, was the angel explaining that he arose to encourage and protect King Darius in his first year, or the archangel Michael? Just to say the text could read either way. Both are equally true, or both could be equally true. We literally read in Daniel 6 how King Darius was deceived by the men in his kingdom to have Daniel killed, but their plot was revealed and Darius rescued Daniel from the lion's den. And then we read this at the end of Daniel 6. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. Right? So we see how the angel was sent by God and was part of that protection of Daniel. And we also know that the angel was warring in the heavens for Daniel and for King Darius, right? And we saw how there was a positive attitude towards King Darius. The angels of God are ministering servants to help God's people and to fight the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places, right? So we have to understand that the angels are doing their job and we have to do our job. We have a obligation to be praying and understanding the things that are written in God's word. So as we read now the beginning of chapter 11 with this understanding the context, right? It's the third year of King Cyrus, and the angel said to Daniel as he began to reveal this word to him, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I rose to be an encouragement and protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. So this prophecy was given in the third year of Cyrus, 536 BCE. 3 more kings would arise after him, and then the fourth king would gain riches and attack Greece. So it's important to understand this, right? So first of all, the Medo-Persian kingdom continued in name only, meaning the Persians really were the rulers of this kingdom. We never hear of King Darius again, King Darius the Mede. He more than likely died after that first year, as we talked about previously. Now, the kings of Persia after Cyrus, right? Because Cyrus was ruling when this word was given, so he said 3 more kings would follow, and that's Cambyses, Smirdis, and then Darius the First. And then he says the fourth one is the one who becomes great in riches and attacks Greece, right? So that's Xerxes, or he's also called Ahasuerus in the scriptures. And he reigned from 485 to 465. Now, King Ahasuerus is the king of Persia who took Esther for his queen. And King Ahasuerus was known for his great riches, as we read in Esther 1:4. King Ahasuerus also amassed a great army and invaded Greece in 480 BCE. So Daniel 11:2 was fulfilled exactly as stated concerning the fourth king of Persia from King Cyrus. Now, as this word of prophecy is revealed to Daniel, the next verses speak of the kingdom of Greece until verse 35. So I asked the question, did the kingdom of Persia come to an end after Ahasuerus attacked Greece in 480 BCE? And the answer is no. The kingdom of Persia continued as the dominant kingdom for another 150 years with many other kings after King Ahasuerus. The relevance of this attack against Greece, right, of King Ahasuerus against the kingdom of Greece, was that Alexander the Great would use this as a motivation for attacking Persia 150 years later. So that's the connection. That's why it's mentioned. And again, just to emphasize, there's a gap of 150 years and numerous Persian kings between verses 2 and 3. The prophecy of Daniel 11 focuses on the highlights which are relevant to the message of the times of the Gentiles and then their interaction or influence over Israel, right? Their interaction with the Jewish people and with Jerusalem. We have to understand this in context, and we have to understand this is how the Bible generally records things, the things that are most important and relevant to the topic. Now, I asked the question, why are only 2 verses given to the Persian kingdom, while the Greek kingdom is given nearly 33 verses in Daniel 11? And I believe it's for the simple reason of, again, this whole issue of the times of the Gentiles and how we see how each of these kings and kingdoms influences the Jewish people and Jerusalem in some particular way, as well as the temple in Jerusalem. Now, Cyrus, especially, and the kingdom of Persia are actually unique in that they were not fighting against the Jewish people in Jerusalem. They were actually setting the people free. They were supporting Jerusalem. They were Cyrus gave the command to build the temple, right? So because of the positive role that Cyrus and the Persians had on the Jewish people, there was not a lot of emphasis, except for saying that Ahasuerus attacked Greece because that's the next kingdom and that's how it continued. So it's important to understand this. Also, Esther was the queen of Persia, right? So again, you have that support of the Persian crown toward Jerusalem, toward the Jewish people. So let's continue in this next set of verses, beginning in verse 3 of Daniel 11. And it says, "And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded. For his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them." Now we know this is speaking of Alexander the Great. He is the mighty king, spoken of here in verse 3. And we've already had extensive teaching on the Greek kingdom and Alexander the Great and how this all fits together. We know he died an early death, and his kingdom was divided among 4 others, not of his lineage. The following 31 verses of Daniel 11, verses 5 to 35, focus on the 2 dominant kingdoms that came out of the divided Greek kingdom, right? So there were 4 main kingdoms. There were 4 kingdoms that came out of the Greek kingdom, and there were 2 dominant ones, right? And they are referred to as the kings of the south and north in this section of scripture because of their location. We're going to talk about that. So let's just read a couple more verses here. We're not going to read all the verses in Daniel 11. It's a long, dramatic going back and forth between these 2 kings. But let's just read the first few verses here, beginning in verse 5. "Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His domain will be a great dominion indeed. And after some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. But she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times." So it's kind of this back and forth and making agreements and arrangements. Now, the kings of the north and the south refer to the 2 dominant kingdoms of the 4 divisions of the Greek Empire, right? So it's important to understand this. You have the king of the south in Egypt, that's his base. You have the king of the north based in Antioch of Syria, and that's the Seleucid kingdom, right? So again, Seleucus was the first king of the north, so it's named after him, based in Syria. But as you can see, all the yellow there is a northern kingdom that has a huge territory. And number 2, Ptolemy was the first king of the south, based in Egypt. Now, the kings of the south and north are important in as much as they control the territory of the land between them, the land of Israel, right? Jerusalem and land of Israel are right in the middle of these 2 kingdoms. They constantly go back and forth, and we ultimately see how Jerusalem is affected by this. Now, Daniel 11, 5 to 35 contains the events between the kings of the north and the kings of the south from about 323 until 164 BCE. We have the respective kings of the north on the right and the kings of the south listed on the left for those who are interested. We're not going to go through all these verses. Just to focus here at the end of this section in Daniel 11, in verses 21 to 35, we read the specific actions of Antiochus Epiphanes. Again, we've already covered Antiochus Epiphanes in great detail in chapter 8. So we're not going to review all of this, but it's going to focus on some of the things that are unique here in Daniel 11. So we read we know how that Antiochus Epiphanes became king of the northern Seleucid kingdom in 175 BCE. And we read this prophecy in Daniel 11:21 as this king is introduced. And it says, in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes was a main character prophesied about in Daniel 8, as we've already talked about, and we're just going to focus on the applicable information here. Now, it's interesting to note that in God's word, this king is called a despicable person here in the verse we just read. However, Antiochus IV called himself Epiphanes, meaning the illustrious one or the divine one. Antiochus Epiphanes tried to make himself equal with God. And we talked about this earlier. But again, it's important to understand that he was a type and a foreshadow of the Antichrist who is to come, as is evidenced by his actions. And that's why he's even focused on so much in these verses, because he is a foreshadow of the Antichrist, right? So let's just continue to read here in verse 29, where it says, at the appointed time he will return and come into the south. But this last time it will not turn out the way it did before, right? So Antiochus Epiphanes is the king in the north, and he would attack the king of the south at an appointed time. It's important to understand this phrase here. The Hebrew for this phrase is la moed, the word moed, an appointed time. Now, the timing of the events of this king of the north, Antiochus Epiphanes, to attack the king of the south in Egypt was an appointed time, just as the final earthly king, the Antichrist, will act in the final 7 years, and that is an appointed time. It's important to understand that we often use the word moed in the scriptures for appointed times, and in Leviticus 23 you have the Sabbath and all the different biblical holy days, right? But there's also appointed times for war and even for evil, as we see here. Now, as we read this verse in context, together with 30, we read this. At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south. But this last time, it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened and will return and become angry at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. So this act of Antiochus Epiphanes to attack the king of the south failed as he was stopped by quote-unquote ships of Kittim. So what is meant by this phrase? Who is the kingdom behind the ships of Kittim? The ships of Kittim refer to the Roman forces which came against Antiochus Epiphanes and his army at that time. So I just want to read here a quote by the biblical scholar John Wavard as he explains the historical background of what was going on at that time. And he says here, quote, here, however, he, Antiochus Epiphanes, was met near Alexandria, right, in Egypt, by a Roman consul named Gaius Popilius Linus, who summarily demanded that he leave Egypt at the pain of being attacked by Rome. The Roman consul is reported to have drawn a circle about the king and told him that his decision had to be reached before he stepped out of the circle. Rather than risk a war with Rome, Antiochus, although greatly displeased, withdrew from Egypt immediately and conceded Egypt to Roman power. Prophetically, this is indicated in verse 30 by the statement, quote, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him, unquote. Usually taken as a symbolic representation of Roman power, which came from the west past Kittim, a reference to the island of Cyprus, which was to the west of the kingdom. Okay, so the prophecy of Daniel 11:9, 29 to 30 was clearly fulfilled by the acts of Antiochus Epiphanes and the response of the then rising empire of Rome. This historical fulfillment not only verifies the prophecy regarding Antiochus Epiphanes, but also clearly documents the rise of the fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire, which would fulfill its appointed time as well, right? So the Greek kingdom was losing its worldly dominance through these different divisions of the empire, and the empire of Rome was rising, and we know that it became the dominant kingdom following the Greek kingdom. We then read an important detail here in verse 31 where it says, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, right? This is talking about forces from Antiochus Epiphanes, right? And do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Now, in Daniel 8, we have already studied how Antiochus took away the regular sacrifice and desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. And that was for a period of 2,300 evenings and mornings. And we went into great detail about how that equals 1,150 days because you have 2 sacrifices every day, right? That was the Tamid sacrifice. Now we read about the setting up of the abomination of desolation. Now, the reality that Antiochus and his men set up an abomination of desolation in Jerusalem at the place of the Holy Temple is a historical fact. We read the following in the book of 1 Maccabees regarding Antiochus the king. Quote, "And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by every unclean and profane thing, by everything unclean and profane." So again, this is just how Antiochus instructed the people to forsake God. He made it illegal to worship the God of the Bible as detailed in the Torah, right? And to literally do the opposite, and even to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals. We then read about the setting up of an abomination of desolation a few verses later in 1 Maccabees 1:54. Quote, "Now on the 15th day of Kislev in the 145th year," right? That's that calendar, "they erected a desolating sacrifice on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah." Right, so this desolating sacrilege was more than likely an idol to the god of Zeus. As I stressed in the previous teaching of Daniel 8, it is vitally important to understand the details of each prophecy and to determine from our perspective today what has been fulfilled historically and what has yet to be fulfilled. Just as we learned in Daniel 8, there are some who confuse the little horn of Daniel 7 with the small horn of Daniel 8, as well as the abomination of desolation mentioned here in Daniel 11:31 with the abomination of desolation spoken of in other prophecies, right? A lot of people want to just say, oh, it talks about abomination of desolation. That must mean the end times and Antichrist. But we clearly see that it is not here. And there can be more than one, and that's important to understand. So this phrase, abomination of desolation, in Hebrew is shikut meshumem, right? And shikut is an idol, a detested thing, or an abomination. We read about it in Deuteronomy. God said, do not worship the shikutzim, the idols in the land when they go into the land of promise. Meshumem means that which brings desolation or makes desolate. So we see a form of this phrase 3 times in the book of Daniel, in 9:27, 11:31, and 12:11. We've already studied this, but in Daniel 9:27, the context is clearly in the final week, the final 7 years of the end times, and we read there about the abomination which is set up, which makes desolate, right? We don't need to read that verse again. In Daniel 12:11, we also read of the events which will take place in the final week, the final 7 years. Including here in verse 11, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Now, the events of Daniel 12 are clearly in the end times and are still clearly future, as we will clarify in the next teaching. Further confirmation of the events of Daniel 11:31 that they are now history, whereas the events of Daniel 9:27 and 12:11 are still future, are the combination of history, right, what we see fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes, what's written in 1 Maccabees, and the words of Yeshua in the New Testament. Both Jewish and Christian scholars agree that the events of Daniel 11:1-35 have been fulfilled leading up to the acts of Antiochus Epiphanes in verses 21-35, including the setting up of the abomination of desolation at that time. The details of Daniel 9:27 and 12:11 have not been fulfilled in history, and Yeshua himself confirms this by speaking of the yet future abomination of desolation, which must be set up prior to his second coming, as noted in Matthew 24. And I'm just going to read select verses here from Matthew 24. You can read the whole chapter in context on your own, right? But this is a clear teaching about this series of events. Yeshua said regarding his coming and the end of the age, right? He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And then we skip to verse 21. For then there will be a great tribulation, such has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. And then skipping a few verses to verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Now, Yeshua explained in these verses the events that will immediately precede his return. Number one, the abomination of desolation will be standing or set up in the holy place. Number two, this act will mark the beginning of the Great Tribulation, this 3.5-year period. And then number three, Yeshua's second coming will occur immediately after the Great Tribulation. The sign which we are to look for and be aware of regarding Yeshua's return is that which is written in the prophet Daniel regarding the setting up of the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation spoken of in Daniel 11:31 is history and was fulfilled in 167 or 168 BCE. The abomination of desolation spoken of in Daniel 9:27 and 12:11 is yet to be fulfilled. Important to understand the details. Okay, let's move on to verse 32 and 33 and following in Daniel 11. Again, focusing on Antiochus Epiphanes here. Still, at the very end here, by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Right, so again, we see here that at the end of this time of Antiochus Epiphanes, the appointed time of the end is still to come, as clarified here. And as we continue in Daniel 12, we see how that is eventually comes to the end times, right? It clearly says it. So just to mention this phrase, until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time in Hebrew is ad et ketz ki od lamoed. Until the end time, for it is still for the appointed time. Again, that lamoed, for the appointed time. Now the great warfare will continue until the end, until that appointed time. Now, Daniel 11:32 to 35 brings a close to the reign of the despicable king Antiochus Epiphanes without mentioning his death, which was clearly indicated in Daniel 8:25. In Daniel 11:36, we transition to the end times and to this other king. This is similar to what we saw in Daniel's 2 and 7. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, a prophetic jump from the fourth kingdom in those chapters, Rome, to the end times and the final 7 years. In Daniel 9, we also saw a focus of the fourth kingdom, Rome, which cut off the Messiah, Jerusalem, and the temple in the first century, clearly spoken of in Daniel 9:25 to 26, and then a prophetic jump to the final 7 years, the covenant of the Antichrist, the final earthly king, as specified in verse 27 of Daniel 9. Now, Daniel 11:36 to 45 is a clear prophecy about the final earthly king who is yet to be revealed. Now, before we read the verses 36 to 45, it's worth noting that there are varying opinions regarding which king is being spoken of here. There are some who believe that these verses continue to speak of Antiochus Epiphanes. However, they fail to actually account for all of the acts of this particular king. They try to attribute verses 36 to 39 to Antiochus, but then they find no connection to verses 40 to 45. Now, the following is a commentary from a Jewish study Bible, meaning not believers in Yeshua, which well illustrates the confusion of trying to explain verses 40 to 45 as Antiochus Epiphanes. So let me just read this commentary from a Orthodox Jewish perspective, and it says this, quote, "From this point, the predictions do not correspond to events as known from other sources, and scholars agree that the author must have been writing at the time of the events described in the preceding verses." So they're trying to say, we don't understand how these verses fit. They must explain something that happened before. What is described is a cataclysmic battle of the major powers that would mark the end of the present age, and the reference Ezekiel 38-39, but the campaigns predicted here did not occur. So again, this commentary is from a traditional Jewish perspective and tries to understand what is being communicated, and they try to say it's Antiochus Epiphanes, but they can't make it work, and it's because they have no knowledge or expectation of the Antichrist and what is written in the New Testament. Now, the text in Daniel 11:36-45 clearly speaks of the Antichrist in agreement with other prophecies, and I want to just point that out as we go through this. The verse 36 of Daniel 11 begins with the phrase, "Then the king will do as he pleases." The verses that follow describe this unique king in various ways, including his religion, his sexual desire or lack thereof, his actions, his global warfare agenda, and his own death. Instead of reading these verses in their entirety, I will list phrases from the text which describe the king in order to more clearly see who he is and what he will do, in essence showing how Scripture confirms him as the final earthly king, right? So number one, it's important to understand that verse 36 just speaks of the king, whereas all the preceding verses talked about the king of the south and the king of the north, right? So that again separates it. And now I just want to read selected phrases from these verses, which is really 99% of the text here, but just to kind of list it, right? So on the right is actually just the numbers of the phrases, but then you have in parentheses the beginning of each verse, and they go in consecutive order, 36, 37, 38. And then you have the quotes, and then on the right you have a corresponding prophecy, whether it's in the New Testament or the Old Testament, that verifies that this has to be the Antichrist because of all these connections. Okay, so number one, the king will do as he pleases. Number two, he will exalt and magnify himself above every god. Number three, he will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. Number four, he will prosper until the indignation is finished. Number five, he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers. Number six, he will show no regard for the desire of women. Whether he is homosexual or some other version, we don't know. Number seven, nor will he show regard for any other god. Number eight, for he will magnify himself above them all. Number nine, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god whom his fathers did not know. Number 10, he will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. Number 11, he will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Number 12, he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and cause them to rule over the many. Number 13, he will parcel out, he will divide up land for a price. Number 14, at the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. Again, just to mention here, right, these words are highlighted because they obviously show that we're no longer talking about the king of the south and north. This is a different king, as these two kings will come against him. Number 15, he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. Number 16, he will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall. Number 17, these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. And just to mention, these three territories are all in the modern country of Jordan. Number 18, he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. Number 19, he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. Number 20, rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him. Number 21, he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. And in the final verse of Daniel 11, verse 45, it reads, quote, "He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him." And just to rephrase that, right? He will establish his camp in the land of Israel between the seas, probably the Mediterranean and Dead Seas, and the mountain of Jerusalem, whether he be located on the mountain or around the mountain of Jerusalem. So we also know that the Antichrist in the end times will take his seat in the temple of God in Jerusalem and assemble the kings of the earth against the Lord, but they will be defeated. So who is this king spoken of in Daniel 11:36? Throughout Daniel 11:5 to 35, there was a continual battle between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. Now we read just about the king in verse 36, right? We also read that the king is neither the king of the north or the south, but rather the kings of the north and south will fight against this particular king. Now, the kings of the north and south in these final verses of Daniel 11 are probably not limited to the kings of Syria and Egypt, but are more likely symbolic of the nations of the world as a whole in the end times. And that kind of corresponds with other scriptures as well. Now, we read in verse 40 that the event recorded here will occur at the end time, be'et ketz in Hebrew, right? So it's very clearly talking about that time, this particular king being at the end time. This king is identified as being alive at the time of the Great Tribulation, as stated in Daniel 12:1, which is a continuation of this prophetic word. And just to read this next verse in Daniel 12:1, just to tie it together, right? Because it says, "Now at that time," so it's connecting the previous time of that final earthly king, the Antichrist, with what's written here. "Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time," right? So it's obviously speaking about the Great Tribulation. And then in the next verse, it talks about the resurrection as well. So we know that this is the time of the end. The king of Daniel 11:36 to 45 is described in a consistent manner with the final earthly king and the Antichrist of the New Testament, while being set in the context of the end times. The prophecy of Daniel chapters 10 to 12 informs us that there will be great warfare until the end, until the time of the end. From the days of Daniel until today, there has been war on earth, and it will continue until the end times are fulfilled. Tzava Gadol. There is continual war on the earth and in the heavens. Whether it is physical or spiritual, each and every one of us is surrounded by great warfare. We need to be aware of this. We need to be conscious of this and be fighting in the proper ways. So how do we respond to the warfare that is with us today and will continue until the time of the end? We must know Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of armies. We are familiar with this title, Adonai Tzevaot, but I just want to connect it here, right? So the word Tzava is host or army or warfare, and that's in the singular. Tzavaot is the plural, right? So as a result of Tzava Gadol, the great warfare, we need to know and be actively in agreement with Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of warfare, the Lord of armies, the Lord of hosts, right? So that is who he is. Adonai Tzevaot. Greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world, right? Great warfare demands a great army and a great general, and that is Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of armies. We must fight on our knees. Circumstances that are out of our control demand help from Adonai Tzevaot. So where in the Bible do we first see this title of God as Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of armies? We first read about it, this title, the Adonai Tzevaot, in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And it is in the words of Hannah. It's in her prayer that she offers, right? Now, Hannah was a woman who knew physical and spiritual warfare in her own life as she felt shame for being barren, and she was continually tormented by her rival, her husband's other wife. And we read this in 1 Samuel 1:6. Her rival, however, would provoke provoke her bitterly, to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. Hannah was in an impossible situation in life. She could not do anything about it except cry out to Adonai Tzevaot. And then we read this prayer of Hannah, the situation here in verses 9 to 11. Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, Adonai Tzevaot, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Adonai Tzevaot heard the prayer of Hannah, answered her, and gave her a son, the prophet, the priest, Samuel. Right, this amazing man of God who anointed the first two kings of Israel. He anointed Saul and he anointed King David. We are not left without weapons of warfare. Our daily battles demand help from Adonai Tzevaot, just like Hannah, until the time of the end. And whether it's something personal in our community, in our nation, in our world, we need to understand that there is someone greater who fights these battles on our behalf. Don't neglect the power of prayer to our commander-in-chief, Adonai Tzevaot. Tzava Gadol, great warfare, demands a great general, Adonai Tzevaot. This is the conclusion to Daniel chapter 11. Please read Daniel chapter 12 for the next teaching, and keep these things in mind. Be a people of prayer. Again, this is some of the resources I use to prepare these teachings. And if you are benefiting from these teachings, I just want to encourage you to give a generous gift today. Ne'er L'Reglai is a nonprofit organization, and we're totally dependent on donations from people like yourself. So thank you. And you can just click the Give tab on our website, ne'erlereglai.com. See you again next time.